Welcome to History 111, Lecture 17, Foreign Policy Challenges of the Jefferson and Madison Presidencies. One of the first big issues of Jefferson's presidency is the Louisiana Purchase, and it involves three separate issues: the expansion of presidential powers and how they might be coming into conflict with the Constitution, the Lewis and Clark expedition, and the vast expansion of the United States that brought on. Now, the territory this purchase concerned was really that yellow territory in the middle, although it's going to have key implications for the green territory you see all the way on the left side of the map, because that's going to be something the Lewis and Clark expedition is concerned with. But what you should know and think about is if you think about the modern borders of the United States and you look at what's yellow, you're talking about roughly 1/3 of the current United States. The story of the Louisiana Purchase in a lot of ways begins with the French and Indian War, and at the end of that war, that territory in question was given to Spain by the French in order, really, because they could no longer hold it and they didn't want the British to gain control of it. Now, Spain by 1798 had cut off American access to the Mississippi River, and that had really impacted American river trade. Now, at that same time, French forces returned to New Orleans, and the United States is alarmed and become concerned because what's happening is the French are going to now reoccupy this territory. There's a lot of things going on in the Napoleonic Wars, and a return of Louisiana to France is something that the Spanish are doing as a way to help settle some debts. So we see this and we become concerned, so Jefferson sends diplomats to negotiate a settlement with France. And those diplomats were told that if they failed to get a deal about access to the river and settling these issues that were coming up over the Louisiana Territory, that they were to travel to Britain and negotiate an alliance with France. In other words, if we couldn't settle things with French over this territory, we were going to go to war. Now, France at this time does have ambitions in North America, but two things are really going to derail that. One is the Haitian Revolution that really decimates French military strength in that region, and two, this is the Napoleonic Wars. There's very few and very short periods of peace between Britain and France, but they're basically at war almost the entire time, and at the time this is occurring, they are at peace, but the likelihood of war seems very, very high. So, while Americans are going to travel to France to talk about questions concerning access to New Orleans and the Mississippi River, the French come in with a proposal to simply sell it to them. The French need money. Now, while there was some opposition to the acquisition based on the idea that Jefferson overstepped his authority, the purchase of Louisiana went forward. And what happens is the United States acquires land that would form all or part of 15 states and 2 Canadian provinces. And if you're wondering why Canada's involved in there, it's because there's a tidying up of the border that occurs later on through some treaties. While the Lewis and Clark expedition is very famous for exploring the territory gained during the Louisiana Purchase, its original purpose was very different. Jefferson had decided to scout the region all the way to the Pacific even before the idea of buying it was on the table. What he wanted was maps and geographic information and know what potential for trade and alliance with natives existed. He was looking at what could we use to exploit as resources in a potential war with France, and, much more importantly, Jefferson wanted to establish claims in the Pacific Northwest based on a claim of discovery, and to do that, we had to send an expedition there to explore the area and claim it as ours. And if you remember that map in the beginning, that's that green territory all the way on the left-hand side of the map. So the Lewis and Clark expedition, while it's very deeply tied in with the Louisiana Purchase, also had some other goals based on some boundaries and expansion of the United States on the Pacific coast. Now, while the Louisiana Purchase ultimately achieved a settlement of those issues in a very peaceable fashion, Northern Federalists believe that Jefferson has seriously overstepped presidential power, and they plan to secede and form their own Northern Confederation in protest. And this is very high-reaching and very far-reaching. The sitting Vice President Aaron Burr joins the conspiracy. Now, these conspirators feel, however, this new nation is only going to be viable if New York and New Jersey join, so they don't declare independence right away. When it becomes clear that Jefferson is not going to support Burr's re-election as vice president, Burr decides to run for governor of New York because that's going to be a key state in pulling off their conspiracy. Now, Hamilton, who is a Federalist and was the Treasury Secretary in Washington, opposes the plot and opposes Burr personally, and Hamilton accuses Burr of treason. And Burr loses the election and blames Hamilton for this, and particularly on the damage that had done to his reputation when Hamilton called him a traitor. And their personal animosity becomes so great that it ultimately ends with a duel. And it's a duel that Burr wins, and he's charged with murder. Burr flees and ends up on the Ohio River with a band of armed men. Jefferson, through various reports, comes to believe that he's planning to invade New Orleans, and Jefferson orders him arrested and tried for treason. Marshall, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, ultimately blocks a lot of the evidence against Burr, and Burr is acquitted. But this has a lot of consequences. This greatly discredits the Federalist Party as all this stuff starts to come to light. And it also shows the government is relatively weak and had huge amounts of land to administer. And individuals could really make power plays that threaten stability because it's a weak government, relatively speaking, with a large area, and it's hard to control it all. And it was also exposed there were serious disagreements about the limits and role of the various branches of government. Now, with the issues concerning Aaron Burr behind them, Jefferson is looking increasingly at what's going on in Europe and the Napoleonic Wars. And an important thing happened in that Britain and France both made laws that make it a crime for anyone to trade with the other. The idea here being to give the navies of Britain or France, the case may be, an excuse to attack neutral ships that are trading with the other side. And in addition, Britain, who needs sailors, began capturing American ships and forcing the sailors to serve in the British Navy. Jefferson does not want war with Britain, or with France for that matter, and decides the best way to go about this is to ban American ships trading with any foreign port. And this is widely unpopular, and ultimately has to be dialed back 2 years later in what's called the Non-Intercourse Act. Now, while internationally Jefferson's approach is one of trying to keep Americans out of the line of fire, domestically he starts to look at Native Americans in a different light, and he tries to give the tribes a choice between becoming farmers and joining white society or leaving the country. And the idea here is to strip Britain of potential trade partners or allies in advance of any type of armed conflict with them. And Britain had already begun supplying tribes in anticipation of war. In addition, there's a significant native rebellion happening at this time that's fueled by religious zeal. One of the key figures is a man called the Prophet, and he's preaching rejection of the sinful and corrupt white world, as he calls it. And he is an important ally in the form of a man named Tecumseh, who believes that by forming a strong coalition, the tribes could resist further encroachment in their lands. And these individuals are pulling together a mass movement which actually is threatening the borders of the United States. Now, the Prophet's followers do believe that magic would protect them in battle, and this is proved not to be the case at a battle called Tippecanoe, and Tecumseh's coalition begins to fall apart at that stage. A number of factors really began to move the United States towards war with Britain. First and foremost was the imprisonment or seizure of American sailors and American ships, and also the perception that Britain was very strongly helping people like Tecumseh and the Prophet try to resist U.S. domination, and people began to talk about that as acts of war. In addition, American politicians, for various reasons, start calling for an invasion of Canada. Some that has to do with supplying of Native American tribes with weapons and so on. Others have to do with this idea of driving Britain totally out of the Americas and creating an enlarged American state and all of that. There's a lot of reasons why people call for it, and it's something that people start to get interested in. And in addition, Madison becomes president. So now we have a new president, and we have a lot of reasons why people are mad at Britain. So at this point, Congress declares war. Now, Britain is occupied with Napoleon until his disaster in Russia. And what that means is, for the first 2 years, Britain is really focused in Europe. So from 1812 to 1814, Britain really doesn't do much in North America, except for where the United States invades Canada. And there's a few successes, but by and large, the United States is unable to break British defenses. And Tecumseh and his last remaining followers are going to ally with the British, and he's ultimately going to die in battle against them. Now, for the first 2 years, this war is essentially being fought at sea. During this time period also, events within the United States interfere and distract the Americans for a little bit. This is what's called the Creek War. Now, within the Creek Nation, there were two major factions. One that was kind of pro-American, and another that was pro-traditionalist. And there's a Red Sticks faction which is pro-traditionalist, and they're kind of inspired by Tecumseh. And when the New Madrid earthquake happens, this is seen as a sign. And to be fair, this earthquake was so strong it made the Mississippi River flow backwards. Now, what happens is the traditionalists and the Red Stick faction are going to start attacking Americans. And a Tennessee militia officer named Andrew Jackson, who become president later, launches a punitive expedition, and this ends in the mass slaughter of women and children. And the Creek end up ceding huge amounts of land and being forced to withdraw on the threat of being exterminated by Jackson and his men, because he's not going to go ahead and attack the Creek army in the field. He's going to go into the undefended villages and kill everyone there. And he uses those sorts of tactics and terror to really break their will to fight. In 1814, Napoleon surrenders, and then Britain is no longer occupied, so they invade. And their invasion is successful to a certain degree. Washington is set ablaze in retaliation for a similar attack in Canada. The government has to flee, but the British invasion of the mid-Atlantic stalls at a place called Fort McHenry, and the events at Fort McHenry are kind of memorialized in a poem, which we then use later as the lyrics for the national anthem. The British also invade the north, and they stall there as well. And the British have a third prong when they invade New Orleans. Now, Andrew Jackson, who is now a general in the army, mounts a defense with a bizarre coalition of militia, free blacks, natives, and pirates, and he ultimately wins the battle and becomes a national hero. Now, what no one told Andrew Jackson or the British forces was that the war was over. Now, the reason for that is the war and the peace was being negotiated in Europe. And it took about 2 weeks for the message to arrive that a peace treaty had been in fact signed. So Andrew Jackson wins the most important battle of the war after the peace was signed. Now, even though the British invasion ultimately stalled on all fronts, most of the war was serious military failures for the United States. This also leads to a brief resurgence of the Federalist Party in New England, and there's what's called the Hartford Convention, and they reassert this idea of nullification, that states can override federal laws. And they're going to demand 7 constitutional amendments and implied that they would secede if the amendments did not go through. But with the end of the War of 1812, the entire movement in the Hartford Convention falls apart, and those amendments never go anywhere beyond them simply talking about it. Even though neither side was close to victory, the peace settlement emerged because the major causes of the war were no longer present. Britain wanted to prevent the United States from trading with France to weaken them during the Napoleonic Wars. But the war with France is over and Napoleon's been deposed. There's no longer that issue. Britain's native allies have been severely crippled. There's no longer a need for the British to support them because those allies are no longer there. And even though the British invasion stalled, the American army was not faring well. Both sides were looking at it and saw this. They had reached a stalemate. The reasons they were fighting were no longer all that relevant, and both sides preferred peace to continuing a war that looked like it would be long and costly and whose outcome was uncertain. So what's the big idea? Well, first and foremost, there's the Louisiana Purchase. Americans are becoming more assertive internationally. Americans want to expand, and particularly with a goal towards the Pacific Northwest. But all of that's going to spark off a debate over the limits of presidential power. And you see things like threats of secession and rebellion. The government, although it's more assertive, is still somewhat weak. And with the War of 1812, again, we see the idea of more expansion with the invasion of Canada, albeit another successful one here. And we see more and more debate about the new Constitution and what it means in practice, and now we see debates over the limits of federal power, and we see the Hartford Convention becoming a major issue, and the idea of nullification emerging again. This idea of nullification is one we're going to see all throughout this course. Another important consequence of this time period, though, is the death of the Federalists. And with the Federalist Party basically done, we're going to see the nation is going to be ripe for a political realignment that we're going to talk about in a later lecture. See you in the next lecture.